Like most Americans in 1945, the scientists and their families at Los Alamos were anxious to put the war behind them. Many returned to universities, leaving behind a scientific enterprise that faced an uncertain future and a new body of knowledge which continued to be shrouded in great secrecy.
There were very few people who actually understood the atomic bombs as they existed in the period right after World War II. The security restrictions were still intense. The development of atomic bombs, nuclear bombs, was still in an early phase.
Everyone understood, kind of outside of their official capacity, that the atomic bomb was a weapon of extraordinary devastation. So they had this tool, this weapon, on the one hand, and the knowledge that they were, the knowledge base that they were building was for much more discriminate force.
On the other hand, there had to be assumptions that would be made that would guide military planning. Would you or wouldn't you use the atomic bomb?
A commander's job is to demonstrate how to prevail in a war, and therefore how to plan for that war. And as such, nuclear weapons, pretty much from the beginning, have been treated as instruments of war.
These weapons were simply looked upon as being essentially larger conventional weapons. I think that Truman in particular had a very personal understanding of the damage that these weapons could do, and I believe that Truman really didn't want to use them.
Private reflections were quite apprehensive about what the implications of this were for the future of humanity. In terms of his public pronouncements, he, of course, associated the bomb with victory in World War II, and also for a brief time period at least, Truman and the Truman administration seemed to seriously explore possibilities of international control.
If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
Even as President Truman issued a final ultimatum before the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, he promised to redirect atomic power towards the maintenance of world peace. The stage was set for the development of a proposal for the international control of atomic energy by an expert board of consultants that included Robert Oppenheimer, who had led the development of the atomic bomb. In less than a year, Bernard Baruch, a successful Wall Street speculator, was appointed as the U.S. representative to the UN Atomic Energy Commission. There, he presented the American proposal, which came to be known as the Baruch Plan. Almost immediately, the Soviet delegation raised objections to the plan's proposed controls on fissionable materials and an on-site inspection regime that threatened ongoing secret work deep inside Russia.
The Soviet position was that, we're going to expect another world war in, say, 20 years, so we need to start preparing for it now. At the end of the war, the Soviet leaders made a number of speeches setting out their view of, how international relations would develop after the war. And Stalin said that Lenin's theory of imperialism was still operative, and that as long as imperialism existed, there would be wars.
When George Kennan, the American chargé in Moscow, reported on Stalin's speech, official Washington first began to regard the Soviets as a threat.
Kennan's long telegram was meant to do several things. One, to alert Americans that Russia was not going to be easy to live with. Secondly, if we wait and hold them, in the long run, communism might lose its expansionist self-confidence. Now, Kennan's containment doctrine said that if you keep the Russians contained, keep them from expanding, they will look at their own article of scientific analysis that says the world is bound to have come under communist control and see that it's wrong.
But throughout 1946, the Soviets consolidated political power in a series of buffer states, forming what Winston Churchill would call an Iron Curtain.
With the onset of the Cold War symbolized by Churchill's speech, increasingly the emphasis was on maintaining nuclear supremacy, preparing America and the West militarily for this long and desperate struggle.
Churchill's suspicion of Joseph Stalin at the end of World War II had been confirmed, and he cautioned Truman to protect and maintain the American monopoly of the atomic bomb.
The fact that that came more or less simultaneously with the other effort to promote international control, I think shows the ambivalence of that period.
As he contemplated the possibility of an emerging Soviet nuclear capability, Truman was also determined to maintain civilian control of the bomb and appointed David Lilienthal chairman of the newly created Atomic Energy Commission. In April 1947, its first report warned of serious weaknesses in the situation from the standpoint of the national defense and security.
One thing we really don't know today is how much did the Soviets know about how few functional atomic bombs we had in 1946 and 47. By many measures, we had none. What we had was on a shelf in a state that would take weeks to get it ready for use. These would have been very manpower-intensive nuclear weapons that had to be kept ready. And we weren't doing that because there wasn't the motivation to do it, and we weren't expecting the Cold War, weren't expecting to use weapons against the Soviet Union.
In 1947, the Truman Doctrine, ensuring the independence of Greece and Turkey, drew a line preventing further Soviet expansion in Europe.
The foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion.
You have to remember that the United States was doing something that was revolutionary through World War II and immediately beyond. We were making decisions that we would enter and remain engaged in the world in a way that we had never done before.
And the United States had loaned Europe about $11 billion in various aid programs to kind of kickstart the French, British economies. And in late 46, early 47, economic progress begins to slow. And so there's this growing sense of emergency.
In 1948, the collapse of Czechoslovakia to communist rule shook us up in that Czechoslovakia had been the only democracy in Eastern Europe between the wars, and it seemed like this was the last kind of straw.
But I think it's the Berlin crisis that really begins to give this a kind of military edge. But when Stalin imposed the blockade, I mean, he was resisting what he saw as moves to create a separate West Germany.
The blockade on Berlin shook us up more. It's the second blow within a short period of time in 1948, and it directly involved American forces. It seemed to be an attempt maybe to set dominoes going to affect all of Germany. We mainly bet on a non-military approach. We were using military transports to fly coal and food to West Berlin. But as a backup for that, we also did make a big move of American bombers to Britain.
I think it's fair to say that the contingency planning by 46 and 47 was focused on the fear that you may have a war with the Soviet Union.
We warned the Soviets that if they did some things they could easily do, shoot down our planes or send tanks into Berlin, that we were moving, allegedly, the nuclear forces into Britain.
I think sending the B-29s to Europe was a kind of reminder that the U.S. had the atomic bomb, but Stalin knew that. He didn't need to be reminded. To stop the airlift, he'd have had to escalate the situation. I think that's what he didn't want to do. He knew there were limits to the confrontation.
Just the mere existence of atomic bombs in 1948, I think, helped restrain him.
The American hints at using nuclear weapons in 1948 shows that when you have a monopoly, you can lightly play with nuclear threats and get some results.
With the prospect of conflict on the horizon in Western Europe, it had become clear to the Truman administration that there was now a critical need for some fundamental policy guidance about the use of atomic weapons. Berlin crisis of 1948 was the first of several critical drivers of U.S. strategic nuclear policy. As they prepared contingency war plans, the Joint Chiefs of Staff sought guidance on the use of atomic weapons.
I don't think there's really any clearly defined U.S. policy toward whether nuclear weapons will be used and how they might be used before the autumn of 1948. And that is what makes NSC 30 and the NSC 20 series so important, they begin to come to grips with some of those issues.
NSC 30 declared that the U.S. was prepared to use atomic weapons in the event of war, and the decision to do so would rest with the President.
The President will decide to use them when he wants to. He'd hate to use them ever again, but if it's necessary, he will.
NSC 30 first established a deterrent role for atomic weapons as a counterbalance to Soviet forces in Eastern Europe. The National Security Council also developed NSC 20/4.
But what we now had is we're settling down into the rhythm of the Cold Wars. We're now settling down into the Soviet Union as the enemy. As we're now settling down into the United States strategy for deterring the Soviet Union, if deterrence fails, having to fight a war with the Soviet Union, being based around nuclear weapons, we're settling down into that rhythm where there's a process that guidance flows into the planning system, and that guidance is going to come out of the National Security Council mechanism. Both Hoyt Vandenberg, who was Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and the Joint Chiefs themselves are beginning to ask the question, if we had to execute the contingency war plans that we have tomorrow, what would happen? Teams were sent out to look at the readiness of Strategic Air Command. They came back with very negative reports.
So Vandenberg looked around. The senior World War II leadership is sort of gone. The Akers, the Spatzes, and LeMay's head and shoulders above everybody else. So he gets the call.
LeMay was a brilliant operator, and I think probably fair to say a brilliant commander. Very dynamic, very energetic, and he wanted a force that could, in fact, fight a nuclear war.
LeMay was continually concerned about the lack of photographic intelligence. They began the atomic targeting based on maps, and some captured German reconnaissance photographs.
So they took the analytical inputs and they sat down and said, you know, the weapon will go here, it will go here, here's how we're going to get there.
And that you would also employ the same ideas that have been used during World War II for deep interdiction strategic bombing, and that is to take out the enemy's industrial capacity. Now, of course, industrial capacity was also co-located with cities, and so there you would have a tremendous amount of disruption using nuclear weapons on those targets.
LeMay's primary objective was to ensure that SAC would have the capability to deliver a single massive attack, and for this he would require a force of new long-range bombers.
Harry Truman came to office without a lot of experience, certainly no experience in foreign affairs to speak of. The one thing that he brought to the White House was a very fine-tuned look at how you did budget making. And he insisted that Forrestal stick within very, very tight constraints.
James Forrestal became the nation's first Secretary of Defense in the midst of a brutal budget battle among the newly formed Joint Chiefs. Forrestal tried but failed to resolve the differences. In February 1949, Eisenhower was brought in to mediate the dispute over budget priorities that favored the Air Force's new B-36 atomic bomber.
The Navy saw this as a threat to its ability to project power from aircraft carriers inland. They saw the Air Force perhaps as threatening the control of Navy, sea-based aviation.
The Navy is posing some very serious questions about American nuclear strategy and reliance on strategic bombing. And that, to me, is kind of the more important dimension to the Admiral's revolt. Because what they're saying, in a sense, is what some people in the Air Force itself had admitted. General Harmon did an analysis of the strategic bombing campaign and concluded that it'll do serious harm, serious damage to the Soviet Union, but it's not an assured war-winning strategy.
Soon, decisions would be made by Forrestal's successor, Louis Johnson, ensuring that SAC would get its atomic bombers. In early summer 1949, they represented the only U.S. strategic capability to deter the Soviets. In July, the Senate would ratify the NATO treaty, and now atomic weapons would underpin Article 5 of this new security commitment. One month later, an event, unfolding deep inside the Soviet Union, would seriously challenge this deterrent capability.